You remember the smell before you even opened the front door. Fresh cut grass in the yard, maybe a hint of mothballs from the hall closet, and underneath it all, something baking. That was Grandma's house, not a house you visited, a world you stepped into. The screen door had its own sound, a creak and a slap that told everyone inside you'd arrived. And once you were in, you were surrounded by things. Not clutter, treasures, things with a place, a purpose, a story. Somewhere on that counter sat a tin cookie jar, and if you were lucky, it was never empty. And in the living room, that plastic-covered sofa was waiting for you, cool and squeaky under your legs no matter how hot the day was outside. We're counting down 25 of those objects today, the ones that made Grandma's house. Stick around, because 2 of them are coming back at the very end, and one of them might be the very thing you're picturing right now. Here's the truth, though. Those objects didn't get thrown away because they were bad. They disappeared because the world got faster. Newer came along, and newer always looks like it's winning, at least for a while. Plastic gave way to something else. Manual gave way to automatic. And somewhere in all that convenience, a house that used to feel like a hug started to feel like just another house. Before we start, if any of these bring back a memory, do us a favor and hit subscribe. We're building a place here for people who still remember, and we'd love to have you with us. Number 25. The smell of the house itself. Before any single object, there was the smell. It wasn't one thing. It was a blend. And every grandmother's blend was a little different, but somehow it always meant the same thing. Warmth, safety, home. By some accounts, it was talcum powder mixed with coffee that had been on the stove for hours, plus whatever was baking, plus the faint sweetness of an old wooden dresser that had absorbed decades of perfume. You couldn't buy that smell in a store. You couldn't bottle it. It existed in exactly one place, and when you walked in the door, your whole body relaxed before your brain even caught up. Old-timers remember walking into that house blindfolded and knowing exactly where they were. That's how strong it was. It disappeared for a simple reason. Houses changed. Candles and air fresheners took over, all trying to smell like something specific, a spring meadow, a clean linen. But that manufactured scent never once smelled like anyone's actual grandmother. The real thing wasn't a fragrance. It was years, slowly built up in wood and fabric and habit, and years like that don't get bottled twice. You can't smell it again. But somehow, thinking about it, you almost can. Number 24. The hand-embroidered dish towel. It hung on the oven handle, or folded neatly over a rack by the sink, and it was too pretty to actually use. You knew that the moment you saw it. Little flowers stitched in the corner, maybe a rooster, maybe initials that weren't even hers, passed down from someone even further back. Grandma didn't buy that towel. She, or her mother, or an aunt with steady hands and long winter evenings made it. Embroidery was something women did while listening to the radio, while sitting with each other, while waiting for the bread to rise. Every stitch took time nobody was in a hurry to save. You'd reach for it without thinking, and someone would gently take it out of your hands. Not that one, honey. Use the plain one. That towel was for looking, not touching, and somehow that made it more special, not less. It disappeared as embroidery itself disappeared. Machines could stitch a design in seconds. Cheaper, faster, and eventually dish towels just came printed instead of stitched, sold in packs of 3 from a store shelf, indistinguishable from 1,000 others. The plain towels dried the dishes, but the pretty one told you somebody loved that kitchen enough to spend their evenings making it beautiful. Number 23. The wood-framed mirror by the front door. It hung right where you'd see yourself the moment you stepped inside, heavy, ornate, the glass slightly wavy with age in a way that made your reflection look softer than it really was. Grandma checked her hair in it before answering the door. You checked yours before you were allowed to leave the house. That mirror had been somewhere else first, more often than not. A bedroom, maybe, in a house before this one. Furniture didn't get replaced every few years back then. It got moved, inherited, given a new spot when the old one didn't need it anymore. The frame carried little dings and scratches nobody bothered to explain, because everybody just knew. Standing in front of it, you felt looked at and cared for at the same time. Grandma would appear behind you in the reflection, straightening your collar, and you'd stand a little taller. New houses came with builder-grade mirrors, flat and forgettable, bolted straight to bathroom walls, with no frame at all. Nobody inherits those. Nobody will ever wonder about the scratch on the corner of a mirror that came standard with the house. That entryway mirror didn't just show your reflection, it showed you belonged there. Number 22. The artificial plant in the ceramic planter. It sat in the corner by the window, or maybe on top of the television, green and full and never, ever changing. No watering, no wilting, no dead leaves to sweep up. Just there, permanent, holding its shape through every season for as long as you could remember. You probably touched it once as a kid, just to check. The leaves felt waxy, a little too smooth, and you'd get a gentle correction for it. Don't fuss with Grandma's plant. It wasn't really about the plant. It was about not touching things that had their place. Real houseplants took work back then, more than people had patience for in a busy household, and a good artificial plant was something you invested in once and kept for good. It came in a heavy ceramic pot, sometimes with little stones or marbles pressed into the dirt-colored plastic base, and it looked, from a few feet away, close enough to real that nobody minded. It disappeared as real plants got easier to keep alive, and as taste shifted toward things that were supposed to look natural, not just resemble nature from a distance. Fake became something to hide, not something to display proudly on the good end table. That plant never asked for anything and never let you down. There was something almost comforting about a piece of Grandma's house that never changed, in a world that always was. Number 21. The floral wingback chair. It had its own spot, usually near a lamp, usually angled just so toward the television or the window, and everyone in the family knew, without being told twice, that it was hers. You could sit there if she wasn't home. The second she walked in the room, you moved. The fabric was a busy floral print, roses or cabbage-sized blooms in colors that don't get made anymore. The kind of pattern that seems almost loud until you realize it's been the same chair your whole life, and you can't imagine the room without it. Wooden legs, slightly worn armrests, a cushion that had long since taken the shape of the person who sat in it every evening. That chair is where she read the paper, where she did the crossword, where she'd fall asleep for 20 minutes after Sunday dinner with her chin dropping slowly to her chest, and nobody dared wake her. Furniture like that used to be bought once and kept for good, reupholstered instead of replaced when it wore through. As furniture got cheaper and more disposable, and as living rooms shifted toward matching sets bought all at once from a showroom floor, that one particular chair, worn into the shape of one particular person, stopped being something people held on to. Sit in a chair like that today, somewhere in a thrift store, and see if you don't feel, just for a second, like you're not allowed to. Number 20. The house slippers with the printed pattern. They lived by the back door, or tucked half under the bed, soft-soled, a little flattened at the heel from years of wear, printed with some pattern that belonged to another decade entirely. Small flowers, maybe, or a paisley swirl in colors that had faded from being washed too many times. She wore them from the moment she got up until the moment she got dressed for real, shuffling across linoleum in the kitchen, the soft scuff of fabric on floor becoming one of the quiet sounds of that house, right alongside the ticking clock and the hum of the refrigerator. If you stayed the night, sometimes there'd be a spare pair waiting for you, a size too big, and you'd shuffle around trying to imitate that exact same walk, feeling instantly, briefly, like you belonged there in a grown-up way. Slippers like that were made to last years, not months, sold in general stores and catalogs as a practical item, not a fashion one. As comfort footwear turned into its own industry, all memory foam and moisture-wicking fabric, that one specific printed pattern, worn thin from one specific pair of feet, stopped being something anybody kept around that long. Nobody's slippers today will still be around in 20 years. Hers were. Number 19. The round wall clock with Roman numerals. It hung in the kitchen, usually above the doorway or over the table. Plain white face, black hands, those Roman numerals marching around the edge like something out of an old schoolhouse. It ticked, not a soft modern tick you had to strain to hear, a real tick, steady and audible, the kind that filled a quiet room. You'd hear it during Sunday dinner when the conversation lulled. You'd hear it late at night if you couldn't sleep in the spare room down the hall. That clock never stopped, never needed anything but a fresh battery once in a great while, and it never once lied to you about the time. Meals happened when that clock said so, not whenever anyone felt hungry. There was a rhythm to that house, and the clock on the wall was quietly in charge of it, the same way it had been for as long as anyone could remember. Digital clocks came along, then phones that told the time without being asked, and the wall clock slowly became decoration instead of necessity. Then not even that. Nobody needs a clock on the wall when the answer is already glowing in their pocket. But something was lost in that trade. A house that runs on its own clock, its own rhythm, feels different than a house where everyone's checking a different screen. That clock kept the whole family on the same time, together. Pattern break. Before we get to the next batch, it's worth stopping here for a second, because there's something bigger going on underneath all these objects. Grandma's house wasn't just full of things. It was stable, predictable, in the best possible way. Every object had its spot, and that spot never changed. The chair was always in the corner. The clock was always on that wall. The cookie jar was always in reach. When the rest of your life felt uncertain, when you were a kid figuring out the world, that house was one place where nothing ever moved without warning. That's not really about furniture. That's about safety. A house where everything stays put becomes a house where you can put your guard down completely, because nothing is going to surprise you. By some accounts, that's exactly why so many people say Grandma's house is the one place they can still picture with their eyes closed, room by room, object by object, decades later. We've lost some of that. Houses today get redecorated on a whim, moved through quickly, updated to match whatever's trending. There's nothing wrong with that. But it does mean fewer of us are building the kind of house that stays exactly the same for 30 years, waiting patiently for the next generation to walk back in and feel like nothing has changed. That's what we're chasing with the next 8 objects, the stuff you used with your own hands, in that kitchen that never once needed batteries or an outlet to work. Number 17. The lace curtains in the kitchen window. They hung there year-round, delicate white lace, letting light in but never quite letting the outside world look straight through. Sunlight came in filtered and soft, throwing little patterned shadows across the counter and the floor that moved slowly as the day went on. Somebody made those curtains or bought them from a shop that specialized in exactly that kind of thing, fine lacework meant to last generations if handled carefully. Washing them was its own small ceremony, hand-washed, hung to dry, never thrown carelessly into a machine that might tear the delicate threads. You'd sit at that kitchen table doing homework or shelling peas or just watching the yard, and the light through that lace made even an ordinary afternoon feel like something a little more gentle, a little more cared for. Blinds came along, cheaper, easier, adjustable with the flick of a wrist. Then came the plain curtain panels sold by the yard at any department store, no lace required. Lace curtains started to feel fussy, old-fashioned, one more thing that needed careful hands instead of a quick wipe down. That soft, dappled light never quite made it into the newer houses. Blinds let light in or keep it out. They never once turned an ordinary Tuesday afternoon into something worth remembering. Number 16. The oversized cylindrical cheese grater. It lived in a drawer, or hung from a hook if the kitchen had one, a tall metal cylinder with a hand crank on top, far bigger than anything you'd find in a kitchen today. Turning that crank took real effort, and grating a block of hard cheese was a small workout, not a task you'd forget you were doing. It came out for special occasions mostly, holiday dinners, a big pot of something on the stove that needed a generous topping, the sound of that crank turning, metal on metal, cheese falling in soft little curls into the bowl below, was one of those sounds that meant company was coming, or something good was in the oven. Kids loved being handed that job, standing at the counter turning the crank as hard as their arms could manage, feeling important, feeling useful, feeling like they were part of making the meal instead of just waiting to eat it. Pre-shredded cheese in plastic bags eventually took over. Cheaper, faster, no crank required. The convenience made sense. But it also meant one more small ritual, one more reason for a kid to stand at the counter next to Grandma, quietly disappeared along with it. Nobody grates a block of cheese by hand anymore. Nobody misses the effort, but some of us miss standing there, turning that crank, being asked to help. Number 15. The scarred wooden cutting board. It was thick, heavy, worn down in the middle from decades of chopping in that exact same spot, covered in knife marks that told the story of thousands of meals nobody kept count of. It smelled faintly of onion no matter how many times it was washed, a smell baked so deep into the wood that it became part of the board itself. That board had been there longer than most of the appliances in the kitchen. It had cut vegetables for dinners going back further than anyone standing in that kitchen could remember, passed down instead of purchased, inherited instead of picked out at a store. You'd watch her hands move across it with total confidence, never looking down, the knife finding its rhythm on wood that had absorbed exactly that motion a million times before. It wasn't precious. It was used, hard, every single day, and that's exactly what made it feel permanent. Plastic cutting boards came in, easier to sanitize, dishwasher safe, replaceable the moment they got a deep enough scratch. That practicality made sense in a world worried about food safety. But something about a board with history, a board that remembered every meal it had ever helped make, got left behind along with it. A plastic board gets thrown away, that wooden one got handed down. Number 14. The hand crank coffee grinder. It sat on the counter or got pulled from a cabinet each morning. A small wooden box with a hand crank on top and a little drawer underneath to catch the grounds. Using it meant standing there for a minute or two, turning steadily, listening to the beans crack and grind down into something you could smell before you could see. That smell filled the kitchen before the coffee itself ever hit water. Rich, a little sharp, unmistakably morning. It was one of the first sounds of the day in that house, right along with the creak of the back door and the clatter of the good dishes coming down from the cabinet. Grinding coffee by hand was slow on purpose, or at least it felt that way. There was no rushing it, no shortcut, just the steady rhythm of that crank turning while the rest of the house slowly woke up around it. Electric grinders, then pod machines, made all of that unnecessary in a matter of seconds. Coffee got faster, easier, available at the push of a button instead of a few minutes of turning a crank by hand. Convenient, certainly, but that morning ritual, the smell filling the kitchen slowly instead of arriving all at once, quietly disappeared along with it. Coffee today is instant. Back then, it was earned, one crank at a time. Number 13. The manual can opener with the crank wheel. It clamped onto the edge of the can and required real effort, turning that little wheel around and around while the blade slowly worked its way through metal. It wasn't fast. It wasn't effortless, but it worked every single time. No batteries, no motor, nothing that could break down at the worst possible moment. That can opener lived in the same drawer for years, sometimes decades, a little rusted at the hinge but somehow always sharp enough to finish the job. Opening a can of something for dinner meant standing at the counter for a minute, turning that crank, feeling the small satisfaction of watching the lid slowly separate from the can. Kids would ask to try it and struggle, the grip and the angle harder than it looked, and Grandma would finish the job with a practiced flick of the wrist that made it look easy after you'd just proven it wasn't. Electric can openers came along promising to save that minute of effort. Then pull-tab cans came along and made openers unnecessary altogether for a lot of things. The manual crank opener slowly disappeared from most kitchens, replaced by convenience that asked nothing of you at all. There was something honest about a tool that only worked if you worked it too. Number 12. The metal colander shaped like a handle. It hung from a hook near the sink, or sat stacked inside a bigger pot, punched full of holes in a pattern that had probably not changed in 50 years. A single handle on one side for tipping and draining. Steam rose off it every time a pot of pasta got poured through, fogging up the kitchen window for just a moment. That colander did one job, and did it perfectly. Night after night, dinner after dinner. It wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. The sound of water rushing through those holes into the sink, followed by the clatter of the pot being set down, was one of the small, everyday sounds that meant dinner was close. You'd stand back from the steam if you were young enough to still get underfoot in the kitchen, watching her shake it once, twice, getting every last drop of water out before the noodles went back in the pot for sauce. Plastic colanders came along cheaper and lighter, then eventually built-in strainers in modern pots made even that unnecessary. The metal one, dented in one spot from being dropped once decades ago, slowly gave way to something newer that nobody would ever bother keeping for 30 years. Number 11. The wooden-handled flour sifter. It stood upright on the counter, a metal canister with a hand crank on the side and a fine wire mesh at the bottom, used to sift flour light and airy before it went into a bowl for baking. Squeezing that handle, or turning that crank, sent a soft cloud of flour drifting down, always a little bit of it landing somewhere it shouldn't. Baking day meant that sifter came out first, before the bowls, before the sugar, before anything else. It was the beginning of a process that took the whole afternoon, not the 20 minutes a box mix promises today. The flour had to be sifted, the butter had to be worked by hand, and none of it happened quickly. You'd get handed the sifter if you were old enough to be trusted with it, squeezing that handle over and over, watching the flour fall in a fine white mist, feeling like you were doing something important even though you were mostly just making a mess on the counter. Pre-sifted flour eventually made that whole step unnecessary. Baking got faster, simpler, one less tool required. But that soft cloud of flour drifting down onto the counter, that specific sound of the crank turning, disappeared along with the reason for it. Number 10. The cylindrical hand grater with the different sides. It sat in a drawer or hung on the wall, a simple metal cylinder with 4 different grating surfaces, one for fine, one for coarse, one for slicing thin, used for everything from cheese to cabbage to potatoes. Using it meant holding it steady with one hand and working the food across it with the other, careful, always careful, because everyone in that kitchen had scraped a knuckle on it at least once. That grater did the work of half a dozen modern kitchen gadgets, all in one simple tool that never needed to be plugged in or charged or replaced. It got used for slaw in the summer and potatoes in the winter and cheese any time of year, washed by hand and set in the drying rack afterward, ready to go again tomorrow. Food processors eventually did that same job in seconds instead of minutes, with far less risk to your knuckles. The convenience was real, but something about standing at the counter, working that grater by hand, being present for every single piece of food that went into the meal, quietly disappeared along with it. Number 9. The heavy cast iron bundt pan. It weighed more than it had any right to, dark metal with deep grooves swirling from the center out, kept in a low cabinet because it was too heavy to store anywhere else. That pan made a cake feel like an event, not just dessert, the finished shape alone enough to make everyone at the table sit up a little straighter. Getting a cake out of that pan in one piece was its own small triumph. A careful flip onto a plate, a held breath, then relief when it came out clean and whole instead of stuck in the grooves. Everybody had a story about the time it didn't come out right. That pan came out for birthdays, for holidays, for the kind of occasion that called for something a little more than a plain sheet cake from a box. It never changed shape, never wore out, never needed replacing. It simply got heavier every year it seemed, or maybe that was just everyone's arms getting a little more tired. Lighter, non-stick pans eventually replaced it in most kitchens. Easier to handle, easier to clean, easier to store. But something about the weight of that pan, the effort it demanded, made the cake that came out of it feel like it mattered a little more. Pattern break. Notice what's been happening across this whole batch of objects. None of them were fast, none of them were easy. Every single one demanded a little bit of effort, a little bit of time, a little bit of your attention. That wasn't an accident of the era. That was the whole point. When something takes effort, it means something. A cake from a heavy bundt pan you had to wrestle with means more than one from a box that took 5 minutes. Coffee ground by hand tastes like morning in a way instant coffee never quite manages. We traded a lot of that effort away for convenience, and mostly, that trade was worth it. Nobody's arguing that today's kitchens are worse for having electric can openers and food processors. But convenience has a quiet cost too. It removes you a little bit from the thing you're making. It turns cooking from a ritual into a task. Grandma's kitchen was full of tools that made you slow down, whether you wanted to or not. And in that slowness, without anyone planning it that way, a lot of love got mixed in along with the flour. Next up, we're leaving the kitchen behind and heading into the rest of the house, where the objects get a little more personal and the memories get a little stronger. Number 8. The stained glass style table lamp. It sat on an end table or a side console, a heavy brass base holding up a shade made of colored glass panels, casting warm reds and ambers and greens across the wall the moment it clicked on. That lamp didn't just light a room, it colored it. Turning it on at dusk was practically a ritual, a small click that signaled the day easing into evening, the harsh overhead light staying off in favor of that softer, warmer glow. Conversations happened differently under that light. Slower somehow, quieter. You'd study the pattern in the glass while you sat there half listening to the grown-ups talk, tracing the shapes of flowers or geometric designs with your eyes, memorizing something you didn't even realize you were memorizing until decades later, describing it perfectly to someone who has no idea what you're talking about. That lamp was heavy enough to survive being knocked into 100 times over the years, and somehow it always did. Modern lighting shifted towards simple, sleek, often nothing more than a bare bulb behind a plain shade, easy to mass-produce, easy to replace, impossible to feel anything about. A house with a lamp like that never had a room that felt cold, even on the darkest winter evening. Number 7. The oversized wood-framed photograph. It hung in the hallway or sat propped on a shelf, a black and white photo blown up far larger than photos usually got printed, someone's wedding day, or a graduation, or a portrait from a time before color film was common. The frame was heavy, real wood, the kind that got dusted carefully instead of wiped with whatever was handy. You'd pass that photo every single day without really looking at it, and then one afternoon you'd stop and actually see it, really see the faces in it, and ask who that was. And you'd get a story. Always a story. Nobody in that house ever answered a question about an old photo with just a name. That picture had been in that exact same spot for as long as anyone could remember. Part of the wall itself in a way that newer decorations never quite managed. It wasn't chosen to match anything. It was there because it mattered, and mattering was reason enough. Photos today live on phones, thousands of them, seen once and scrolled past forever. Nobody prints them large anymore, nobody frames them in heavy wood, nobody hangs them somewhere they'll be walked past every day for 40 years until a grandchild finally stops and asks who that person was. Number 6. The pastel Tupperware stacked in the cabinet. It filled an entire cabinet, sometimes two, mismatched lids that never quite matched the container they were meant for no matter how carefully you organized them. Soft pastel colors, yellow and mint green and a dusty pink. The plastic slightly warped from years of hot leftovers poured in before they'd properly cooled. Opening that cabinet meant a small landslide, containers tumbling out from wherever they'd been precariously stacked, and putting them back required a specific kind of patience that only came from doing it 1,000 times before. Every single piece had a job. This one for soup, that one for the good potato salad. That tiny one, always empty, for nothing anybody could remember. Those parties where women sold Tupperware right out of someone's living room were a whole social event in themselves, And whatever came home from one of those parties got used for the next 20 years without complaint, cracked lid and all. Cheap plastic containers eventually flooded every store shelf, sold in bulk, thrown away without a second thought the moment a lid went missing. That specific cabinet, with its specific chaos, its specific colors that don't get made anymore, quietly gave way to containers nobody bothers matching lids to, because nobody expects them to last that long anyway. Number 5. The standing ashtray. It stood in the corner of the living room on its own little pedestal, waist height, a heavy glass bowl balanced on top, polished and empty most days but always there, always ready. Nobody in the house had to smoke for that ashtray to exist. It was simply part of the furniture, the way a side table or a lamp was part of the furniture. Company would sit down, and if anyone lit up, that stand was already exactly where it needed to be. No searching for something to use, no apologizing for the smoke. It was a small piece of hospitality, built right into the room, an assumption that someone visiting might want it, and it should already be handled. Kids would spin the little tray on top when nobody was looking, or run a finger along the smooth glass, until someone caught them and gave a look that meant, "That's not a toy." It sat there through decades of card games and holiday visits and long conversations after Sunday dinner, present for all of it, remembered by almost none of it directly, and yet everyone who grew up around one can picture it instantly. As smoking became less common in homes, that stand slowly lost its purpose, and pieces of furniture built around a single specific habit don't get kept once the habit fades. It disappeared quietly, without anyone deciding to get rid of it exactly, just slowly stopped being replaced when it finally broke or got sold off at an estate sale. Number 4. The plastic-covered sofa. We promised you this one back at the start, and here it is. The plastic that covered the good living room sofa, clear and cool to the touch no matter the season, crinkling and squeaking every single time anyone sat down or shifted their weight even slightly. That sofa was for company, for holidays, for the pastor's visit, and the plastic was there to make sure it stayed exactly the way it looked the day it arrived. Sitting on it in shorts on a hot summer day meant your legs stuck slightly, peeling away with every small movement, and everybody who grew up with a sofa like that remembers that specific sound and that specific feeling. You weren't supposed to really live on that sofa. You were supposed to visit it, carefully, and then go sit somewhere more comfortable the rest of the time. It was protection for something that had cost real money and was meant to last, in a house where furniture wasn't replaced on a whim. As furniture got cheaper and families stopped expecting one sofa to last 20 or 30 years, that instinct to protect it faded along with the need for it. Slipcovers, then simply not worrying about it at all, took over. Nobody covers a sofa in plastic today because nobody expects that sofa to still be there when their grandchildren visit. Number 3. The heavy Singer sewing machine. It sat in its own cabinet, often folded down and disguised as a simple wooden table, until you lifted the top and the whole machine rose up on its hinge, black metal with gold lettering, a foot pedal underneath that ran the needle without a single volt of electricity in some of the oldest models. That machine mended torn hems, took in waistbands, made curtains and pillowcases, and sometimes entire dresses, from a pattern cut out of tissue paper on the dining table. Clothes got fixed in that house, not replaced. A button coming loose or a seam coming undone was a 10-minute job at that machine, not a trip to the store. The sound of it running, that steady mechanical hum with the rhythmic clack of the needle, was one of the background sounds of a quiet afternoon, along with the radio playing low and the occasional creak of the foot pedal picking up speed. Grandma sat at that machine with the same focus other people bring to prayer, guiding fabric under the needle without ever really looking down at her own hands. Clothing got cheap enough, fast enough, disposable enough that mending stopped making financial sense to most people. Why fix a shirt worth a few dollars when a new one costs about the same? That machine, built to run for 50 years without complaint, slowly became a piece of furniture instead of a tool, then eventually not even that. Pattern break. It's worth pausing here, near the end, to say something honest. Not everything about those years was better. Houses were often smaller, chores were often harder, and plenty of people worked themselves exhausted just keeping a household like this running smoothly. Nobody's asking you to pretend it was all easy. But something real did get lost in the decades since. A house full of objects meant to last a lifetime creates a different kind of relationship with your home than a house full of things meant to be replaced in a year or two. When a chair, a machine, a pan is built to outlive you, you treat it differently. You take care of it, you pass it down, and in taking care of it, you end up taking care of the people who use it too. That's really what these last 22 objects have been about. Not just things, but the care wrapped around them. And now, we've arrived at the two we promised you back at the very beginning. Number 2. The tin cookie jar. We told you at the start this one was coming back, and here it is. That tin jar, usually round, usually painted in some cheerful pattern that had chipped and faded from decades of small hands lifting the lid, sat on the counter within easy reach for exactly one reason. It was meant to be gotten into. The lid never went on quite flush, and everyone in the family knew the specific sound it made coming off, a soft metallic scrape that could be heard from another room and immediately identified for exactly what it was. Somebody's in the cookie jar. More often than not, it wasn't empty, and more often than not, whatever was inside had been made in that same kitchen a day or two before, not bought wrapped in plastic from a store shelf. Butter, sugar, a little vanilla, filling the whole house with a smell that meant something good was waiting. You'd get caught reaching in before dinner and get away with it anyway, because that jar existed for grandchildren as much as it existed for anyone, and the rule about not spoiling your appetite bent a little more in that kitchen than it did back home. That jar wasn't really about cookies. It was about a house where you were always welcome to take a little more than you probably should. Store-bought snacks eventually filled that role in most homes. Pre-packaged, individually wrapped, portioned out instead of piled loose in a tin. Convenient, certainly. But something about lifting that lid and not knowing exactly how many were left, about the smell of something homemade filling the whole kitchen, quietly disappeared along with it. Number 1. The rotary telephone. And here it is. The one we've been building toward this whole time. It sat on a small table in the hallway, or mounted right on the kitchen wall, heavy in a way that no phone has felt since, with a cord that stretched, and never quite stretched far enough to let you get any real privacy. Dialing it wasn't instant. You put your finger in the hole for each number, pulled the dial around to the metal stop, and let it spin back on its own before you could dial the next one. A phone number took real time to dial, every single time. No shortcuts, no speed dial, no way to rush it even if you tried. That waiting mattered more than it seems like it should have. In the time it took to dial one number, you thought about what you were about to say. You rehearsed it a little. By the time the call connected, you were ready, present, focused entirely on the one conversation happening on the other end of that line, because there was no other end of any other line pulling your attention away. The whole family shared that one phone, one line, which meant every call was an event. Somebody yelling down the hall that it was for you, sitting on the floor with the cord stretched as far as it would go for a little privacy that never quite arrived. Long-distance calls saved for special occasions, kept short on purpose, because every minute meant something on the bill. You knew the sound of that dial by heart, the specific mechanical whir of it spinning back after each number, a sound completely gone from the world now, replaced by silent screens that connect us faster than ever, and somehow, so often, leave us feeling further apart. That phone didn't just make calls. It slowed you down long enough to actually mean what you said. And somewhere between then and now, in trading that slowness for speed, we lost something we didn't know we needed until it was already gone. Grandma's house is where a lot of us felt that slowness the strongest, and in a lot of ways, it's the thing we miss most of all. So tell us, which one of these 25 hit you the hardest? Was it the smell of that kitchen, the sound of that dial, or something we didn't even mention that you can still picture perfectly right now? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and honestly, they're our favorite part of making these videos. And if you're in the mood for more of these memories, We just put out a video about 25 forgotten school lunch memories from the 1970s that disappeared forever. If you grew up eating lunch in a cafeteria back then, go watch it next. You'll remember more than you expect.